Welcome to the Fortrea podcast. My name is John Kennett, part of the marketing team here at Fortrea, and despite 20 years in the industry, my passion remains high as I seem to learn something new every day about bringing new medicines to patients. This is the third and final episode in a series looking at how sustainability in clinical trials is relevant to the work we all do. What this series is not about is a discussion on solar panels and planting trees. While discussions on those elements has its place, we want to explore how thinking sustainably is positively impacting clinical trials for sponsors, CROs like ourselves, and ultimately for patients. During each of the episodes, we are bringing commentators from across industry to explore attitudes and strategies to what is becoming an increasingly important topic in our industry. In episode 1, we focused on the big picture behind why the lens of sustainability is useful in driving efficiency in trials. Then in episode 2, we took a look at what it is going to take for us to develop a common language and common goals for sustainability in clinical trials across our industry through strong partnerships. In this final episode in the series, we look a little beyond clinical trials, taking a complex systems view on how sustainability thinking is shaping the future of healthcare as a whole, and the role that our industry has to play in informing and promoting this way of thinking. To help me delve into this topic today, I'm joined by a well-informed panel from some of our leading drug developers. Jason Laroche is Director of Innovative Health and Environmental Sustainability in Clinical Research at Johnson & Johnson Innovative Medicine. Jason leads the embedding of sustainability and clinical research at J&J and is one of the co-founders of the EU-funded Digital Health in the Circular Economy project. Dr. Ashton Harper is Head of Medical Affairs for the UK and Ireland at Roche Diagnostics, where he leads a team responsible for clinical research across a broad array of therapy areas, including oncology, cardiology, neurology, infectious disease, diabetes, and women's health. He's had direct experience of the UK's National Health Service as both a doctor and a gastrointestinal surgeon, and during his career in industry, he's designed and initiated numerous novel interventional clinical trials, published and presented his work at multiple national and international medical congresses. And Emma Iovoli, she is a medical doctor and a clinical academic with over a decade's experience in the life science sector. She is lead for medical sustainability at Bayer, which she describes as a unique opportunity to work cross-functionally to enable future-focused health systems transformation. And joining me from Fortrea is Marlene Knupfer. She is Instrument and Translation Manager at Fortrea and is very much involved in influencing sustainability thinking here at Fortrea. My opening question is a simple one, albeit one that I suspect begins to reveal the complexity of our topic today. Jason, perhaps you could seek to explain what a sustainable healthcare model is and give us some examples of it in action.
Okay. It might be helpful to start with just contrasting it with product carbon footprints, which are what people are more familiar with today. And product carbon footprints look at what's the environmental impact of manufacturing and distributing a product to its end user. It doesn't consider any of the benefits of the product when it's actually in action. What sustainable care pathways models do is they look at the overall care pathway itself and how a new therapy or device interacts and ultimately influences the environmental footprint of that care pathway. So in theory, you could have a product that has a larger manufacturing footprint, but because it has superior efficacy, easier route of administration, or other characteristics that lead to it doing a better job preventing or managing disease, it in turn ultimately reduces hospitalization and acute care, some of the major drivers of emissions in healthcare. And so it could ultimately do a better job shrinking the overall footprint of the care pathway. So it's taking that very holistic view of things. Two examples in action. On the pharma side, at J&J, we have Invega Sustenna, one of our products for schizophrenia. Originally, we had a 1-month formulation, so patients would have to get a monthly injection. And then we introduced a new 3-month formulation. The 3-month formulation had a larger manufacturing footprint, more complicated to manufacture. But for both drugs, patients had about a 1-week window to get their next dose. If they drifted beyond that 1-week window, there is a risk of disease relapse. And ultimately, with the 1-month formulation, there were 12 opportunities throughout the year where patients might miss a dose, and a significant number would require acute care hospitalization when they missed that dose. When we introduced that 3-month formulation, suddenly there were only 4 windows of opportunity to miss a dose during the year. And so it ultimately reduced a lot of the acute care and hospitalization we saw from non-adherence, and that acute care and hospitalization had a much greater impact than the drug product itself. So this new 3-month formulation ultimately shrank the care pathway. Another example on the medical device side would be, surgical endocutters, which we've been looking at with the EU-funded Digital Health and the Circular Economy project, where it's been a challenge because surgical endocutters, they're used in keyhole surgery, but they have these long drive shafts that are made of surgical grade stainless steel. They also have titanium and other high-grade or high-performance metals in them. But you ultimately, during the surgery, you get a lot of bodily fluids up the drive shaft. There's just no way to sterilize and clean those devices. And so while we'd love to be able to find a way to reuse them, ultimately what we find is the drive shafts and everything, they have to be basically superheated, melted down, and recycled, sterilizing it, and then the metals are recovered. That requires a lot more energy than, say, reuse, refurbishment, or remanufacture. But what we ultimately see is that the alternative would be, well, don't use endocutters at all. And then you're talking about open cavity surgery. So you see longer recovery times for patients. You see a higher risk of infection, ultimately a lot more hospitalization and acute care, which has a much greater impact than the device itself. So even though the devices, they do have an environmental impact, they create a lot of waste, the alternative is a worse situation.
Thank you, Jason. I'm keen to also hear from you, Ashton, as a particularly with your background in surgery, and Emma, from you as well. But it strikes me that this conversation is not entirely new. The health economics of a product have often been weighed up with that bigger. We used to talk about QALYs in years gone by. We used to think about the overall benefit of a product in that way. So is the carbon footprint of that kind of bringing us forward and causing us to think in more lateral terms than just pounds or dollars or euros?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I mean, I completely agree with what Jason said there. You need to make a balance between, what patient outcomes, the best patient outcomes, and also the carbon footprint of these different pathways. And certainly surgical pathways, in particular, actually, orthopedic surgery is very carbon intensive. And for the reasons outlined by Jason, it's it's very challenging to recycle some of these materials, and we need to do what we can to innovate these pathways to reduce the carbon footprint. But this, I think, particularly for laparoscopic surgery, we don't want to go back to earlier forms of surgery such as open cavity surgery, for the reasons Jason outlined. So there needs to be a balancing act there. But with innovation and technologies, I think we can get there. And it's been interesting. The NHR and the UKRI has recently is funding a number of research hubs across the UK. And one of these is going to be based at the University of Exeter, focused on decarbonising health and social care pathways. And they are going to be particularly looking at orthopedic pathways as well as others to try to decarbonise them. So there's a lot of research in this space underway.
Thank you. Emma, anything from you that you wanted to add at this point?
Yeah, I think I agree with the discussion that we're having. I would say that where we're moving towards within the healthcare sector is to more of a multidimensional approach to evaluating the effectiveness of interventions. So we already had, as you said, clinical effectiveness, we have cost effectiveness, and increasingly we now also need to consider a new dimension of carbon effectiveness. And I think what I really like about what I've heard Jason and Ashton share is that what we can do from a medical perspective is contextualize that, make sure that the information is provided to our healthcare systems in a way that they can then understand what it truly means to the overarching benefit risk for patients, first and foremost, but also to the environment. So we need to start to take that broader lens when we evaluate the benefits and the risks of our medical interventions that we provide from a life science sector perspective. And that's really the exciting work that we can start to take hold of from a medical affairs perspective.
Thanks, Emma. In fact, Emma, you and I were chatting a little bit before we hit the record button here today. I live quite close to London, a city that's seen in recent years the introduction of vehicle emission taxes. Socially unpopular, perhaps, but I suspect that such measures are a good example of this sort of thinking, beneficial to health of the population, but perhaps an uphill battle for societal attitude change. I'm curious as to your view about that similarity and how you're seeing that from a medical perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we're living through a time in which there is an awful lot of change, and it can be hard for us as individuals to adapt to that change. It's equally difficult for us as representatives of our organizations to adapt to that change. So we need to be mindful that those mindset shifts that are needed to take a more sustainable approach to the way that we deliver healthcare is not necessarily something that could be switched on overnight. I also think we need to be mindful of what we might consider to be quick wins and short-term opportunities. And just the example you gave is a fantastic example. So low emission zones in central London have been really good for lowering air pollution, improving air quality. And then, of course, that has a beneficial effect on health outcomes, particularly in respiratory and cardiovascular diseases. So that seems like a really good win, and it has been. But the challenge is, unless we take a systemic view, then what could happen is that we just displace those high emission engines to areas that exist outside of the London low emission zone. So unless we take a systemic view to think about what national level policies need to be implemented and how do we ensure that health is really at the core of all of the sectors at a government level, then unfortunately we may never truly solve some of these complex problems. So that's the challenge that we find ourselves in. We want to make incremental changes, but we also need transformative changes at the same time. And within the work that I've been doing, I find it's helpful to try and hold on to both of those things at the same time. What can we do that's incremental, that's going to add value? And what can we do that's ultimately going to lead to the kind of transformation that needs to happen in order for us to have net zero climate resilient healthcare?
Thank you. Incremental is the key word here, isn't it? Because we're asking for some quite significant changes over the course of this. Jason, I wonder whether you might comment on this in your role. The idea of perhaps as an industry, we're beginning to take more seriously the impact that we have as an industry on the carbon output. What do you see as the next increment, as it were, in that change profile that we need to go down?
Well, one of the things we see across Europe is that most of the healthcare systems, they've committed to net zero, but they're trapped in this paradox where they're trying to figure out, well, how do we reduce emissions and get down to that net zero commitment? While at the same time, we face demographic challenges where our populations are aging, leading to increased demand for healthcare. So it's like, how do you reduce while also meeting increased demand? And so I think you see some healthcare systems, they're looking for answers and they're just trying to grasp at the easiest things they can find at the moment. And so in the second half of this year, France will begin requiring product carbon footprints for all of their tenders. The NHS in the UK, they're going to require them in 2028. Germany is currently looking at implementing product carbon footprints. They just haven't set a deadline for it, but it's anticipated sometime between now and 2030. But that's three of the largest markets in Europe. And for J&J and many other pharma companies, we see that risk. You're just looking at the manufacturing footprint alone. Is there a risk some of our products start to be disadvantaged without ultimately looking holistically at their benefits? And you see well-intentioned people developing apps and solutions where it directly compares those product carbon footprints. And so you see that momentum going there. And so I think that's where we're starting to, you see this growing consensus around the need for sustainable care pathway models.
Mm-hmm.
Because we can argue against product carbon footprints all we want, but unless you provide a viable alternative, you don't have much of an argument. The challenge with sustainable care pathway models is that while the concept has been there, it's a very resource intensive process to build those models because you need to build the models for each care pathway. Pathways are numerous. You also need to build different models for different countries because care delivery differs across countries. And as friction for all of that, there's been no consensus across the EU for what's the methodology we should use. So it's created this hesitation to invest those resources. As our market access teams like to say, like the current health technology assessment framework for Europe is very fragmented, and we have over 100 people just managing the diversity of the framework for Europe. We can't afford to hire 100 more people to manage a fragmented ecosystem of sustainable care pathway models.
Right.
We need adoption of a common methodology to drive that investment in time in building those models out.
Right. So that common methodology then is sounds like something that's going to have to be led by the EU, for instance, at a European-wide level or even a global level.
I think it could be led by industry. I think industry, because it has a vested interest, I think industry could drive it, but it will require public partnership because you need to find that balance between accuracy and utility. You can make these models super accurate, but they'll be so complex to use that nobody will be able to use them. At the end of the day, though, it would position sustainability to become a competitive differentiator.
Mm-hmm.
And so you would need to try to standardize those models and create that level playing field and minimize the opportunity for advantageous assumptions across different users. So I think once you have, if you're talking about standardized models, I think it makes sense for HTA agencies to be the owners. I mean, they would be one stakeholder that has that vested interest in it and could be that neutral arbiter. And for them as well, the value is that today, a lot of healthcare systems, they have a rough idea of their overall emissions, but they don't know what the real hotspots are. So when you're thinking, okay, we need to reduce emissions by 30 or 40% to achieve net zero, it's sort of, let's just take this, everybody takes a 30, 40% haircut. If you had the sustainable care pathway models, you could actually look across the care pathways and see these are the ones where there's already innovation and emissions are trending down on their own. They're already moving in the right direction versus those care pathways where there's not a lot of innovation and they're just continue to drive emissions. They're the real hot spots. Renal disease could be a good example of that, with dialysis just being a huge source of emissions. And then that would allow them to more efficiently deploy their resources towards tackling the hot spots and trying to find those reductions and incentivize innovation in those areas.
That's really interesting, Jason. Thank you. And I know, Marlene, you and I have been talking about the need for more informed choices on diagnostic tests, for instance, how they're ordered. And you've attended a summit recently where this was part of the questioning and the presentation that you had.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yes, so I attended the C3 Summit last year, and they had a great panel on digital health. And actually, I can't right now remember who said it. So if you're listening to this podcast and you did reach out in the comments and let us know. But there was someone presenting on a few facts and golden nuggets about this, and the way things have been evolving in the last 50 to 70 years is that, for instance, a doctor was expected to double their knowledge in about 50 years. So throughout their practicing years, every 50 years, they were expected to double their knowledge. Whereas nowadays, it's expected to double every 75 days. Talking about sustainability, I mean, it's not a sustainable thing to expect your knowledge to double that much in 75 days. And it also informs the next piece or the next golden nugget that they shared, which is that 30% of the tests that are actually ordered by physicians are unnecessary. Whereas on the other hand, the myth tests that should have been ordered but weren't make up 40%. So, of course, this then went into a whole discussion around how AI may be able to help us in the future because it may assist a doctor in selecting tests that they don't actually know exists. And I remember also, Ashton, you mentioning something about, the uptake being slow with these diagnostics, and how can you make sure that a doctor is actually going to prescribe a test or a diagnostic, considering that it may be new or maybe they're unaware of its existence.
Yeah, and just to your point, I mean, I think there is evidence that sometimes there's inappropriate diagnostic testing, but there's also, as you mentioned, a significant amount of missed tests as well. And just to think about a few examples there, I think heart failure in particular in the UK, there's evidence recently to suggest that something like 80% of patients are actually diagnosed on an acute admission to hospital, whereas they should have been really picked up in the community. And simple blood tests now can help to accurately diagnose this sort of condition. So I think it's being more aware of these earlier symptoms in certain conditions to help shift that diagnosis from late stage to earlier stage. And about the adoption of diagnostic innovations, medtech innovations in general is very slow in the UK and wider. And just to give some context, I guess here, when the new Labour government came into power, they've outlined sort of 3 key shifts that they want to see. So this move from analog to digital, a move from sort of hospital-based care to care closer to home in the community, and also a shift from treatment to prevention, so earlier diagnosis. And I think I'm mentioning those because I think achieving those shifts will not only ensure sort of long-term financial sustainability for the NHS, but it's logical to assume that they would also help to realise net zero ambitions. For example, by reducing patient travel to hospitals and also by identifying diseases in earlier stages, there's less intense management required. And I think diagnostic and broader medtech innovations are going to be really crucial to achieving those results, those shifts. But it's important then to think, sort of where does NICE come into this in terms of, health tech assessments and also guidance. And I think there's 2 important considerations here. So whereas legislation for NHS funding for NICE-approved medicines there's legislation within 90 days of final guidance being published, this is not the case for diagnostics. And actually, the adoption of medtech innovations is incredibly slow and may take more than a decade. And also, NICE's current stance is that there is insufficient environmental impact data of diagnostic technologies for routine consideration in all HTAs. And that's something that I think the wider life sciences sector needs to work together to help to change. And it has been promising to see a number of recent case studies published by the UK Health Innovation Network. This is a network that is really responsible for connecting industry with the NHS to accelerate the adoption of innovations. But also the Sustainable Healthcare Coalition as well. And these case studies have really demonstrated how a range of different diagnostic and healthcare innovations can help to decarbonize patient pathways. And what I think, what I hope to see in the future is that sort of we habitually start analyzing the impacts of these new innovations in patient pathways and sort of bake them into our R&D processes. And perhaps if we can do that and we can show promising data, we can help to expedite the adoption timescales. And this would really achieve sort of 4 critical wins. So, patients would obviously benefit from earlier access to breakthrough technologies, and we'd get, through earlier adoption of technologies, we'd also encourage increased investment in the UK life sciences R&D. And achieving those 3 shifts that I mentioned earlier would enable long-term NHS sustainability, and ultimately all of this would help to achieve NHS net zero ambitions.
I hope you're enjoying this discussion, which we have broken up into 2 parts. Please continue listening in part 2, where we will conclude our exploration of a complex systems view on how sustainability thinking is shaping the future of healthcare as a whole, and the role that our industry has to play in informing and promoting this way of thinking.
A study examining 15 years' worth of published research reveals some surprising findings about blood tests. Led by investigators at Harvard Medical School and Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, and reported online in the journal PLOS 1, The large-scale analysis of 1.6 million results from 46 of medicine's 50 most commonly ordered lab tests found that, on average, 30% of all tests are probably unnecessary. The study can be found at https://journals.plos.org.